In February and March 2021, the Christian Evidence Society ran a series of 5 sessions. We at Still Unbelievable attended these. This final episode features Andrew, Matthew and Darren discussing the 4th and 5th sessions, which were Mike Hulme talking about climate and Rowan Williams talking about prayer and spirituality. The first episode covered Jonathan Aitken speaking about truth and Gillian Straine talking about healing. The second episode was Joel Edwards talking about race. Hello and welcome back. We've just had number 4 in the series of 5 from the Christian Evidence Society. This was the one on climate, on the environment and what our responsibilities are there. So I've got Andrew and Darren on the line here. They were there at the same session as myself. So the gentleman that we had on this evening was somebody who I actually warmed to, Dr. Mike Hulme. He apparently made headlines during the Climate Gate 12 years ago, I think that was, when the University of East Anglia was hacked and emails were put out, and many people scoured through those emails looking for obscure phrases that they could take out of context, and they found some phrases, and the whole thing was made into much bigger thing that it was, and we don't hear much about it now because there really wasn't anything of substance there to fight the science of climate. So Mike was he talked a little bit about that, but he also talked about his work and his background. He's a professor of human geography, but he's got a strong interest in the sciences, in climate science, and that's where he does a lot of his work. So that was the person taking all the questions this evening. And my personal feeling and takeaway from this was, I found this one was, of the various ones that we've had, was probably the hardest one to make the link from the subject matter into Christianity. There are parts of Christianity which seem to be very content to question and to challenge science. We don't see it just in climate, but we see it in evolution, we see it in vaccines. I don't think they're as comfortable bedfellows as the other subjects that we've had. But anyway, Mike is a Christian, Mike is a very good scientist, and he manages to match the two together, but I don't think the link is as easy and as fluid as it might normally be. So that's my thoughts on what we've come away with. Andrew, Darren, your thoughts?
I think I agree with you about Mike being a good scientist. You know, it's sort of odd I find it odd anyways, when a scientist is an actual Christian, because the science does this, but at one point he was asked, is existence evidence for God? And he completely threw away the science and anything else you would associate with that. And he says, well, my intuition tells me that it is. So that's what I'm going to go with. And it just seems it was a very stark contrast between how he treats his religion and how he treats his science.
It was, and I'm really on board with that. I noticed that when that question came up, the answer that he gave just didn't feel as strong and as assured as the answers he gave to the science ones, because you can talk to something concrete in those.
There is a tremendous tension between a common Christian teaching about this world and how we look at God and science. I'm going to quote a verse from an old spiritual sung here in the United States. This world is not my home. And first verse goes like this: this world is not my home. I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door. I can't feel at home in this world anymore. It's a really common kind of Christian teaching. I don't think that it is just the fundamentalists. I don't think that it's just the conservatives and the evangelicals who have this problem. And while I respect that he wants to follow the science, he wants to take care of the earth, he wants to save it for our posterity, future generations. And can the world be green in the future? Can we hit the Paris Accord climate target? And he says, yes, maybe. Okay, fine. But Christianity, not just in the United States, but a pretty simple reading of the Bible, which I think is what most people give it when they bother to read, says, if I've got to put something first, the world or God, it's going to be God. Oh, and by the way, there's this promise of Jesus coming back and saving me from this horrible place anyway. And I think that necessarily imparts on most people a good reason not to care overly much about the planet that they live on.
And it just occurred to me while you were saying that if God was actually real and we have all these people that have a personal relationship with God, can't they have a prayer day where they all agree to pray for the earth and have God just sort of snap his fingers and end climate change?
Hey, I'll join them. I will pray that prayer. Yeah, look.
If I had confidence it would work, I would do the same.
It won't work.
Right, and they all know it won't work.
Right.
Makes me wonder, I don't know, whenever something obvious like that pops up and people don't do it, Christians don't do it just because they already know it's not going to work, I always have to question how much they actually believe their own mythology.
I think that we get taught in church, Darren, I know that you never had a deep church background, but I think we get taught that there are certain things that we're not supposed to pray for. It's never said out loud. But we get taught through example the kinds of things to pray for. And here's one that you never hear from the pulpit because we all know it's ridiculous, just going along with that theme. What you never hear is a group of Christians getting together and saying, there was a tremendous car accident. There are a lot of people hurt, but everybody survived. Let's pray to God to turn back time and wipe out this accident. He can even leave us with the memory of the accident so that we know to drive better in the future. But there are kinds of things that Christians just know not to pray for because in some way it's faith invalidating. My loudmouth way of agreeing.
That just seems so obvious to me that it's all fake when you can't even pray for the things that God is supposed to be giving you, and without knowing on some level that it doesn't work. That's probably the thing that I will never understand about religion and Christianity in particular.
I said a minute ago, I think it is hard, very hard, to make a connection between a green earth, our care for the environment, and what happens in the future, and Christianity.
Sticking with the science then for the moment, because most of this, I think, was about science, certainly the initial bit. I think some of the viewer questions brought it a bit more to religion, but certainly the main bulk was a lot about science. Were there any bits from the first half, first three quarters, that struck you too that you'd like to highlight?
Not for me. It was all mostly high-level stuff for a very uninformed audience.
Yes, it was quite high level. I mean, there was a little bit about the Paris Agreement. I think there was probably some useful information in there about the Paris Agreement, about what it doesn't promise, and some of the framework around it. For example, the bit that was news to me, which I probably would have known if I'd actually read a little bit more, or maybe I did know and had forgotten. It's a voluntary agreement, so it doesn't actually have any teeth. So if you fail to make your commitment, there's no penalty for it. That was, I think, a useful bit of information, and possibly even disappointing information. And what I would like is I'd like the countries around the world, when they make these agreements, to actually agree to something binding, so they actually have a motivation to achieve what it is that they've signed. It's one thing to say, yeah, I'll do my best to make this, but if I fail, I'll still get a pat on the back. That's one thing, but it's quite another to say, yes, I'm going to sign up to this commitment to make this achievement, and if I fail, I'm going to lose something in trade, or I'm going to get a penalty in extra tariffs, or something like that. There's things that we could possibly do to put teeth and encourage countries. Give them goals, give them achievements, so that areas around the world can actually make positive impact, rather than something that's literally little more than a signature.
Yeah, I would love to see something like that. Unfortunately, I'm just not sure how you would go giving it teeth, because tariffs don't actually affect the country that you're interacting with, at least not in the U.S., because all the tariffs are paid by local merchants, not by the people that are bringing stuff in from the outside.
Yes, I admit it could well be that part of the reasons why these agreements don't have teeth is because there isn't a way of penalising those that don't make it, which is a shame. And maybe we need to be pushing our politicians to try and do something and try and encourage our politicians when they go on these things. Because apparently we've got a climate panel in the UK. I can't remember, I didn't write down the date that they said, whether it was next year or but it's coming up soon. And maybe there's a good opportunity to lobby our politicians to try and actually make something that's a bit more binding.
Paralleling this just for a moment with Darren's thought about misinformation. A few weeks ago, I had not quite a bitter disagreement with my dad, but a significant disagreement at least over this very issue. My dad is a Trump supporter. He voted for Trump both times. One of the things that he was concerned about between November 3rd and January 6th was Joe Biden's express intent to bring us back into the Paris Climate Accord. And my dad insisted that the U.S. was going to lose by joining the Paris Climate Accord, and we're the only ones paying, and yada, yada, yada. I have known about the accord from the earliest moments that we started publicizing it, and that these are voluntary targets. And the voluntary targets are public. You can just Google Paris Climate Accord countries, and you'll get a full list of the signatories to the Paris Climate Accord and what their commitments are to carbon reduction. But Donald Trump and his bevy of supporters did an absolutely fantastic job of telling people that the U.S. was losing economically as a result of the Paris Climate Accord. It's us nasty Democrats that we just don't want an economically viable and healthy America, and we're sending jobs overseas as a result of the Paris Climate Accord. It went on and on. We discussed it for a good hour. The thing that I never did get across to him was that the Climate Accord is voluntary. Trump need not have pulled us out. We could miss our targets forever with no consequences other than bad headlines, which we were going to get anyway when we pulled out of the Climate Accord.
Yeah, pulling out was just a great big symbolic exercise, really, wasn't it?
Well, it was. And where we had to leave it was my dad just saying to me, well, we obviously don't agree over this, and it's best for us to stop talking about it. The problem with not talking about it is that he never did understand what the Climate Accord was, what our commitment to reduction was, what other signatories were agreeing to, the amount of time they had to hit the targets. He never accepted any of that. And there was no talking him off that ledge.
To wonder about the Christian's ability to understand the difference between fact and fiction. There was a reason that Trump was so successful in his campaigns because, it's demonstrably proven that something like 75 to 80% of everything that came out of that man's mouth was a lie, just a straight up lie. Most people, they'll be marked as, a little bit misleading or something along that lines. But for him, it was always just a straight out lie. And I have to think that that's part of the Christian training because Christians are not taught to fact check what people are telling them. They're taught to take everything that they are told as truth. Because if they had to fact check everything that the people were saying, then that would put the priests at a very big disadvantage. Paris Climate Accords and the climate denial that's predominantly right-wing religious in nature, as well as the anti-science and anti-intellectualism and all that, can all be traced back to this distinct and deliberate culture that Christianity has cultivated in their followers, because they don't want them to check facts. They want them to just believe whatever they're told.
I think it goes deeper than that. I think there's and this goes into one of the questions I asked. I asked the one about evangelical Christianity not accepting climate change. And I think it's much more, it goes much deeper than that into the very culture of that particular brand of Christianity. And my interpretation of it is that they're so used to being not of this world. They've got this message of they're not of this world. What they believe is different. How they need to act is different. What motivates them is different. What the way they get their moral compass from is different. Everything about them is different to the world in which they live. Therefore, they need to be different. And I think that taints the thinking unconsciously to such an extent that they fail to recognize the good science in the world in which they are, because everything of this world must be bad because only the good things come from God. So they see these man-made things, and they see people saying something, and if they're a little bit uncomfortable with it or it challenges them in the wrong way, their first judgment call is, well, you're not a Christian, therefore you're wrong. And I think this way of thinking nefariously seeps into how they view these day-to-day interactions. They don't even realize they're doing it. And then when it comes to something big and something important, like climate change, they immediately reject it because they think they're right, because that's what they do all the other times. And then they end up painted in a corner like this, and they can't admit that they've made a mistake, because admitting to making a mistake means asking themselves a question of, could they be wrong about the other things in their life? And they simply can't go there.
Toward the end of the talk, there was a question brought up about whether Professor Hume, Dr. Hume, would be as committed to the reversal of climate change if we knew that there were only 10 years for the Earth to continue. And the kind of answer that I got, I felt was, I'll just say I don't think he was honest about it. I'm sorry.
I believed him, because he said he wouldn't be any different. He said, whether it was 10 years or 10,000 years, he'd still be committed to the environment and care about it. I believed him because I would answer the same way he answered, in that
I really didn't believe.
Really?
Yeah, I don't even believe.
It's because he's a Christian, isn't it? You just don't believe Christians. It's the same in reverse of what I've just said, isn't it?
No, here's why. I thought about this, and maybe you think about it differently. Maybe you can talk me off the edge. So I was putting my Christian hat on, and I'm saying to myself, okay, I know with certainty, God gave me some sort of foreknowledge. From this moment, count forward 10 years, and Jesus is going to return. The earth is done in 10 years. Would I care about climate change? My answer as a Christian was absolutely not. Not under any circumstances, because I've got one remit and one remit only. And that is to save as many souls as I can possibly save. That doesn't mean that I wouldn't make green-friendly decisions if they were in my hands. But to say that I would care equally about global warming when I know that there's not going to be an Earth in 10 years, but I do recognize that the state of humanity is that 9 out of 10 people or more are going to simply be wood to warm the floors of heaven because they're going to be burned in hell. I think the sole thing that happens to me is I become a radical evangelical, and I really don't believe that global warming would matter to me a single bit.
I think I kind of see where you're going from. Maybe it's a difference between our two cultures, because us British, we're much more tea drinking, prim and proper stuff. We would still stop and do a tie on and put on our jacket if we had to leave the house for the last time because it was burning down. That's just the way we roll.
Right.
Yeah. So
I wasn't really calling you a liar, by the way. You know that.
No, I do understand that. No, I get that. But I think there's two parts and two answers to this. I think on an individual level, I still stand by what I said, and I still believe Dr. Mike in what he said on an individual personal level, because I would still care about those around me. I would still care about the animals that I see on a daily basis. I would still care for all of that, and I would still want to put my rubbish in a bin. However, on a bigger picture, I think if this was a global acknowledgement, if everybody in the world had this same knowledge, I think there will be such a societal breakdown that it might actually become impossible to behave as we want to behave, because nobody is behaving that way. So I think there's two stages of that. So I suspect the scenario that you're describing is most of everybody else would end up behaving in a don't care attitude that would be impossible for me to maintain the good citizenship that I would want to maintain. So therefore I would probably bail because nobody else is doing it. But it wouldn't be because of want, it would be because it just ceases to be practical or possible.
Okay, Darren, you're the tiebreaker.
I have to agree with Andrew on this one. If I knew that for certain 100% that the world was ending in 10 years, I would not care about something that was going to happen, in 15 or 20 years. I would be putting all my effort on how the hell do I get off this world and not burn for all eternity.
The best beer commercial in the world ever recorded is on this topic. There's a sunset. There's a road running through the picture. You hear this great announcer voice say, in 2.3 billion years, our sun will burn out. So you don't know it's a beer commercial. Quite a sobering thought. Even a long time, we won't be here. And you see this Coors Light truck start at the bottom of the picture and start driving down the road. And the announcer says, we say it's never too late to stock up for the big night. Well, it's right on point here, isn't it? Maybe you're right. Maybe Dr. Hulme is one of those really decent people. I'm not sure I am.
He's a tea drinking Brit, so of course he is. I'd like to go to the other question that I asked, and they only asked the first half of the question. They didn't hit the second half, which I threw in there kind of cheekily, but I wanted to know if it was going to come up. So the question I asked was about reduction of the human population, and should that be seen as an effective way of fighting climate change and all that. And he gave some really good answers to that, culminating in the single best way of reducing growth is to educate your women. And so I was really glad to hear him say that. I've known that statistic. But the bit I want to move on to was the second half of my question.
Do you mind if I respond to that?
You go there.
Yeah, because this was my absolute favorite question of the whole thing. And I'm glad you asked it. You're right. He gave a completely awesome response to the question about, giving women complete control over their bodily autonomy, giving them a great education, allowing them to succeed. Through his entire explanation, I kept hoping he would point out that that religion and the Christian church has been the number one blocker to that throughout history.
Yes. Thank you for pointing that out, Darren. I was going to move on and let that slip. And let's go further than that. We've got elements like the Quiverful, but it's not just them, who actively promote numbers of children which are not sustainable.
Oh, yeah. And they're so bad that they will let the mother die. If she continues having children, she will die. They'll keep having children.
Yeah, this whole being anti-contraception, it's a terrible thing. One Christian podcast I was listening to last week even went so far as to suggest that it was a sin if a man had a vasectomy if it was for anything other than a medical reason.
That doesn't even include the anti-abortion issues.
Yeah, absolutely. That's complete prevention. That's before you get onto the mucky subject of abortion. That's about preventing having to have that conversation, and it's a sin even to do something practical to prevent having that conversation. And yeah. I just think that's shocking, and it's this kind of attitude which is common. Let's not kid ourselves here. It is common, and it promotes and it results in a higher than necessary population because people are having more children than they really should.
It's been proven in the States that medically accurate sex education prevents unwanted teen pregnancies, which then lowers the abortion rate. And abstinent-only education does absolutely nothing except exacerbate the problem. Yeah. And the religious right here is tooth and nail against giving children medically accurate information about sex.
Yeah, this really is a case of let's be informed so we can make the best decisions we possibly can. And whether you're comfortable hearing this or not, listeners, there are parts of Christianity that actively block good information and good education getting to the people who need to hear it. Let's try and reverse that.
It's not okay for me to vote with somebody else's body. It's not okay for someone else to vote with my body.
The other thing to pull out of this is, again, the answer that was given to this was the answer from a scientist. There was no religion element in his answer at all, and he gave a great answer.
Yeah.
So the second half of my question was basically, it'll be interesting to hear what your two thoughts on it, because this is a thought that's gone through my head, but I really don't know where I land. So anything that I say, please take it with the knowledge that I actually don't have a firm opinion on this. It's a conversation point that I like to throw ideas about just to see how people respond to. So the second half of my question was, did we miss an opportunity in 2020 for there to be a natural event that could reduce the human population?
What do you mean by did we miss an event?
Letting COVID run wild?
Letting COVID run wild, yeah.
Oh, wow. I was so far away from that.
Maybe I was just too subtle in the question I asked and they didn't get it, which is why they cut that sentence off the question.
I'm just dim. Sorry.
You're American.
Oh.
I'm going to have to cut that, aren't I?
No, you don't. But you should remember that we're also all gun owners.
Let's play this out. No lockdown, no multi-millions to work on a vaccine. Behave as normal. If you die, you die.
And that was the Republican platform in the U.S.
And in Switzerland, they didn't lock down.
We had 500,000 deaths directly due to COVID, and that doesn't include the comorbidity.
Right.
All the other issues, just deaths. We had 500,000 deaths in the U.S. because of COVID, and that's at one point we were averaging a number of deaths that per day that exceeded the number of people that died on 9/11.
That's right. I think it's the Washington University crowd that puts out the death statistic, the projection, and they're still saying another 150,000 dead by June 1st. We are not done with this thing. And in the United States, part of our problem is that we are acting like we're done. If you live in Texas or Mississippi, if you live in Alabama after April 1st, Georgia, you name it, there are plenty of places that still think a mask is a political statement, and they're getting rid of them. And we are killing people because we treat masks like a political statement. But yeah. Matthew, to answer your question, we missed a real opportunity to make a dent not only in our human numbers, but in our reduction of carbon footprint through the natural occurrence of people dying. I just don't know if it was ethical for us not to care and to let it go that way.
I agree. The ethical question on that is a major problem for me, which is why I haven't actually said it as a good thing, because my ethics block me, basically. I can't say those words. My ethical position stops me from saying that. But let's play with it. Let's just imagine for a second what the world might look like. It's probably impossible for us to be accurate, but there'll be serious numbers dead, mostly the poor, possibly greater infiltration into other parts of the world without the medical healthcare that we have, so bigger impact on Africa and Asia if we continue to allow travel around the world and all that. Wealthy people would have locked themselves away because they had the means to do it. People who are not wealthy, who continue to have to work for a living, would have been forced into taking a risk. So then working parents would have died, leaving children as orphans. There would have been huge numbers died. Would it have been enough to make a difference, though, do we think?
I'm trying to look up the current number of deaths worldwide.
It's not even close to the numbers from the Spanish flu 100 years ago, which was something like 50 million. It's not even close, the current numbers. But how much bigger would they have been if we'd let it run? 10 times bigger? 20 times bigger?
I think the death rate they were expecting originally was something like 5%.
That's right.
And we're around about 1%, if that, aren't we?
I think so, yeah.
I've actually gotten pretty good at treating even severe COVID-19. So I don't know what the deaths would have been.
It's like the current death total for worldwide is 2.66 million, which, given we have 7 billion people, is probably not a lot, but we took great care to try to bring that number down. Well, most people did. U.S. not so much, but...
Well, and the question can sort of be pushed out a little bit, and we can ask, should we do the same thing for the next Ebola outbreak? The fatality rate from Ebola is, somewhere around 50%, if I remember correctly. So
that's an even more unpleasant way to die.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's bad juju. It's bad juju. What do we get as a result of allowing these diseases to run their course? I think I would want to ask, do we have a stronger human population in the future? Right, it's not clear to me that sickness results in a stronger population over the long term. Maybe if it did, I would be closer to saying yes. although I still don't think I would. But it's not clear to me at all that sickness that runs its course like that results in a stronger overall population. So I think.
But the goal wouldn't necessarily be to have a stronger population, just a smaller population. How much of our population will we need to eradicate to make an appreciable, in a 12-month period, to make an appreciable difference to our climate change output?
I see. I get the
10%, 20%, 30%?
Oh, easily 50 or 60%.
It means my daughter losing one of her parents, for example. I mean, it becomes that real as soon as you start talking about numbers of 50%.
Right.
Yeah, because we're something like 7 billion people on the planet right now. So to make any, and we were past the point of no return 10 years ago. So in order to do anything appreciable, it would have to be an insanely high amount.
You guys may be familiar with the American Stonehenge. There's a monument here in Georgia, actually, that is constructed to look like Stonehenge on a smaller scale, talking about huge pieces of granite even so. But there are some writing on some of these stones. I think it's the American Stonehenge. One of the recommendations by this guy that's part of this religious group that had to do with the American Stonehenge is to reduce the world population to 500 million or less. I don't know exactly where they got that figure, but I think that sustainability probably is, somewhere around that order of magnitude, not 7.5 billion. And so the reduction might mean that not just that your daughter lose one of her parents, Matthew, but she might lose both of them. I don't know what the reduction would have to be to really make a difference in 1 year. It's astronomical.
At this point for climate change, processes have already started. If we stopped everything, if population went down to zero right now, climate change would still happen. The Earth is warming up because we're putting all of the carbons that were stored in underground back up into the air. And then so all of that would have to be stored back underground in order for it to get back to where it was. And that takes millions of years to do.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought. So that was the idea that I wanted to play around with. Thank you for engaging with that. But there was one thing you did say, Darren, before we went on mic, about you had this suspicion that you thought this one might be put in place to get the message to Christians to think more seriously about the environment. Do you want to flesh that thought out a bit more?
It was when he started talking about climate denial in sort of a broad sense. They were real careful with their wording because they would say some sections of society are against climate change. And I could almost hear the subtext in that of, the Christian right in America that tries to legislate their way into denying science and climate change and everything else. I think that's pretty much who they were trying to reach with this particular episode, because it just seems off topic otherwise. They are the Christian Evidence Society, so why are they talking about climate change if it doesn't directly affect what their people are doing?
Yeah, I think I kind of see where you're going with on that one. In terms of the 5, and I admit we haven't heard the 5th one yet, but in terms of the 5, this one does seem to stand out as being, it's not a subject matter that could be used in an evangelistic sense, or the others, though it's got somebody talking about the faith and how their Christian faith works in their work and how they practice their faith in their work. And they're all people, and certainly some of them, they are people who are ordained people who actively work in Christian ministry. Whereas this one seems to sit as an outlier, and I've already said that it fitted less comfortably with the subject of Christianity. So I kind of see that. And I think, again, because you and Andrew are both over in the States, and the States certainly does seem to be this beacon of Christian-motivated denialism of all things science, or however you want to describe it. And it's just not as blatant here in the UK. So that thinking process. Oh, I hope not. I really hope not.
If nothing else, the U.S. is great at two things: exporting our entertainment and exporting our batshit crazy religions.
I hope not. And but yeah, so I see now why you did think that, because I think it's just so more overt in America, where it really isn't so overt here in the UK. Some of those Christians are making a little bit more noise. I guess that's true. But really, my perception of Christians in Britain is those that deny climate change are the same type of Christians that are vocal in America, but they're so small in number that they just don't feature on the political map.
Well, they used to be really small in number here too, and we ignored them, and now they're a problem. So you may want to take a look into that small little minority you've got going there and see if you can't do something about that now, rather than when you've got a US-sized mess on your hands.
Yeah, see, there's a problem with that now, because now I'm outside of the tent. I can't do anything actively about it because I'll be oppressing the Christians. I'm going to need to go back into the tent if I want to make a change from the inside, and I'm not really sure I want to get that dirty again. Somebody asked a question on alternative fuels, and I think this was another one where I wanted to hear him be slightly more strong. He didn't give a strongly motivating answer to this. He said there are options and we need to look at all of them, and we need to have a portfolio approach. And yes, nuclear really should be on that approach. And yes, we can do it. But it wasn't a yes, we can fist bump kind of answer. And I wanted to hear something a lot more strong on that. So he was very diplomatic in his answer to that.
When we burn carbon fuel, the problem with burning carbon fuel today is that essentially, moment by moment, the world has a carbon budget, an amount of carbon that our globe can handle second by second. We can have campfire. We can process a certain amount of goods moment by moment without doing damage. But when we reach into the ground and we pull up oil, reach into the ground and we pull up natural gas, we are not even burning carbon from this moment's carbon budget. We are actually burning yesterday's moments of carbon. In other words, we are releasing the entire history of this planet's carbon budget right now. When we burn fossil fuel, we are actually burning the carbon that the planet stored thousands of years ago, millions of years ago. And we're burning it at a far greater pace than what the planet can support. The problem is that we are burning the historical budget too. And so when we talk about renewable energy, we talk about alternative fuel sources, the reason we need them is because we are far, far over our carbon debt moment by moment. We're reaching into history and burning its carbon allowance as well. And I don't actually think that a sort of tepid answer about, well, we need to include energy from waves in the ocean, and we need to include wind, and we need to include nuclear, and, we need to do all that. It doesn't get to the heart of the problem. We need to stop burning carbon fuel, and we need to do it right now. It's crazy.
I don't know that we need to absolutely stop, but that's only true if we figure out a way to take carbon out of the atmosphere. There are some interesting technologies out there that are looking into doing just that, because carbon tubes are going to be the future of building materials because they're a lot stronger and lighter. In fact, they could even be the solution to getting us a space elevator. We're going to have a lot of industry looking to take carbon right out of the atmosphere because it's so abundant and we don't need it there. We have some different avenues we can take, but I do agree that we need to move away from carbon combustion engines and away from factory farming. There's clean meat, that's lab-grown meat that will help take care of a lot of that factory farming stuff, because it'll be a lot easier to just grow it in the lab rather than to raise cattle. I'm guessing you're going to see a lot of ranches become the equivalent of wine connoisseurs, building their own strains of meat. It solves the biggest problem vegans have with eating meat as well. I think there's a lot of different paths to solving this problem, because we can't just focus on mitigation anymore. That's just not a winning strategy. We're a decade too late for that. So we have to figure out different ways, taking carbon and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. I don't think preventing sunlight from even getting to the earth is a good idea, because then you're messing around with a lot more knobs than what you really can control doing that. But I think if we can focus on carbon capture and clean meat and electric vehicles, I think those three things would take care of, I'm guessing, probably 80 or 90% of our problems.
I think that's the kind of language we need to use. So we've got all these big global things, when we talked about the Paris Accord, and there's all these big political things. But I think for the individual, for you and for me and for listeners, whether you're Christian or not Christian, I think we need to take the environment seriously, whether you actually agree with the climate change or not. Let's just think about our environment. Let's just think about how we're treating the world in which we live. So think about what it is that you can actually do to make the life of other people and other animals better. Certainly for me and my family, we were faced with this and we made a radical change and we went vegan a year ago. It may not be the right answer for you. I genuinely didn't think it was going to be the right answer for us, but we gave it a go and we've stuck with it for a year. We haven't eaten meat, although we do have chickens, so we have eggs. We haven't bought meat for a year now, and we haven't consumed any meat. I'm happier for it. I'm happier with my diet. I like my diet. What else can you do? We're looking at the cars that we own. We're looking at how we use our energy. Think of the practical things. How can you change your buying habits? How can you change your diet? How can you change the things that you do at home? How can you change the way that you spend your money? How can you change the way you go about your hobbies? What are the changes that you can do that make your impact on this planet that little bit less? My wife tells me that we're spending less on food as a result of the change in diet. And it hasn't changed anything else about it. We're still healthy. We don't need to go to the doctor any more often. Try it. Some of the changes that we can do can be relatively drastic and not actually make that much bigger difference in terms of the things that we do. It just means thinking differently. And part of going vegan has meant that we actually do think differently. We check the foods that we're buying just a little bit more carefully. We check the products that we're buying just a little bit more carefully. Can I have something with less plastic in it? Can I have something that has less of an intensive impact? Can I buy something that has traveled a shorter distance before coming from home? Just little things like that make a positive impact. So I think that's really what I want to do. This wasn't the message that came out of this talk this evening, but I just like people to take a little bit more of a thought about how we as humans impact the world around us, because we haven't got 10 years left on this planet. We've got tens of thousands of years left on this planet, and we do want it to be a world that our children will enjoy. Are we going in a direction where that is maintainable and achievable? Thank you, guys. So next week is the last one. It's Dr. Rowan Williams. He used to be the Archbishop of Canterbury here in the UK, which would be the head of the Anglican Church. The final one, the final five, so it'll be back to talking about faith. He's very much an academic person thinking about faith intellectually. He's not a scientist, at least I don't think he's a scientist. So it'll be interesting to see his take on it. Hello and welcome back, listeners. We're here for part 5, the final part of the Christian Evidence Society sessions. This last and final one was with Dr. Rowan Williams. He was Archbishop of Canterbury here in the UK from 2002 till 2012, so that's 10 years. He was answering questions on the subject of God. Where is God? How does he answer prayer? It's a question that we've encountered and we've engaged with here on Still Unbelievable a few times. Andrew can't make it for us, unfortunately. He's on the road. It was unavoidable. So Andrew wasn't around to listen to the session, nor will he be on here to discuss with Darren and myself. But Darren, faithful puppy as he is back into the co-pilot seat. Welcome back again, Darren. Thank you for joining us for these sessions. How was this one for you?
This one definitely had a lot more to talk about, but mostly what I think we're going to be talking about is how little substance there was of it. Rowan seems to be, a nice guy, thoughtful, but his faith seems to be a lot more faith and a lot less evidence.
Yes, I would agree with that. He was talking about prayer and spirituality with a sub-question, is God really listening? So obviously this is a Christian organisation. Obviously the assumption at the beginning there is God exists anyway. There was a little bit of talk around the Christian approach to Christian institutions, and it opened up a little bit on the conversation around being spiritual but not religious. And I think that kind of really set the scene in terms of thoughtful sound bites, but nothing of any substance to it. So I'll skip straight past that. And I think the thing that I want to jump straight onto, because it was really early on in the conversation, and it made me sit up because I didn't expect it from Rowan Williams. So it took me by surprise when I said it. There are other apologists for Christianity which have said this kind of thing, and this kind of sentence wouldn't surprise me from them, but it did surprise me from Rowan Williams. And it was talking about death and coping with death as a function of life. And he made the comment about under the context of religion and spirituality that Christianity recognizes death as a human limit, as a physical limit, but it's not the end of life, it's a transition to a life beyond, and that the secular world denies our limits and it denies our mortality, and even went as far as to say that it runs away from the subject of death. And I took a bit of umbrage to this. Did you pick up on that phrase, Darren?
I picked up on it. What I picked up was that he recognized that death was a human limitation and then promptly decided to propose his get out of death free card. He was sort of at the same time saying that death is a problem, it's this big thing, it's something you should take seriously, but don't worry about it because, you're not going to actually die. We've got a get out of death free card that we can play because we believe in God and we get to go to heaven.
Yeah, so just before accusing the secular world, us non-believers, of denying our limits, he effectively denied our limits.
Right.
I was disappointed in the 2 years that I've been involved with this podcast, with the conversations I've had with Andrew and with yourself and with several other atheists over the various episodes that we've done. The subject of death has come up a couple of times, and the most obvious person to bring up in the subject of that is the fabulous Dave Warnock from Dying Out Loud and his Death with Dignity conversation. We face up to death as secularists, as non-believers, however you want to label us. We face up to it quite honestly and quite realistically. Part of my deconstruction away from Christianity was accepting that death literally is death. There is nothing beyond. When I die, my consciousness ceases. I become no more aware than I am aware when I'm asleep. I go to sleep, I wake up, I have no concept of the time that's passed between. Death is effectively the same without the waking up and without the occasional dreaming either. And part of my deconstruction, as I said, is fully accepting that and embracing that. And I have no fear of that limitation. I accept it as reality. If you're a Christian that is taken in by that kind of thinking, please don't. It is not how we think. It is absolutely a part of the reality in which we embrace. And I would poke back and say, if you're the one that's saying you live on beyond the death of your human body, then ask yourself, is it really you who's denying death and running away from our mortality? I did not expect this kind of thing from somebody who I respect as a thinker. So it tells me that he hasn't fully engaged with the non-believing world.
Yeah, well, it does actually go to highlight one of the problems with religions in general and Christianity in particular, is that when you start thinking that death is this huge barrier and this huge thing that we have to be afraid of, and then your solution is this magical place you can't actually demonstrate is real, that motivates a lot of people to do a lot of evil things in the world because they think that they're going to be going to heaven because this God told them that if they do these things, then they can go be in heaven and never die. And I think that this highlights why critical thinking is important in life, because on one hand we have Christianity who promises you a life. They can't demonstrate it's true, but they're making you feel better at the expense of your own reason, and sometimes at the expense of your own integrity. And then on the other side, we have scientists and doctors who are dedicating their lives to preventing death, whether that's death by disease or death by aging, extending lifespan. And I think that the secular worldview is much superior in this regard, because not only do we not provide this false hope, this unattainable thing that also happens to come with the threat of hell in a lot of cases.
Moving on from that, because I don't want to dwell on that bit, there were questions around the existence of God. So they talked a little bit about answering the challenge of the existence of God. And he went to the place that many people that we've heard go to as well, which is God is not a thing whose existence you can measure or prove. And for me, it's almost game over at that point. As soon as you say that, I kind of want to shrug my shoulders and say, okay, awesome, let's move on.
Yeah,
let's go and have a beer.
Because at that point, you're just writing a fan fiction. You know, you're not actually providing us with any real information, because if you can't prove that the God exists, then you can't prove that anything you're saying about the God, like he's loving or answers prayers or anything else, actually happens.
Yes, quite. So all these attributes, all these characteristics that you want to give to God, and we had them here: loving, caring, wants the best for you,
intelligent.
Intelligent, shares in your pain, is active in the world. None of those things can follow if you say God is not a thing whose existence can be measured, because all of those things are effectively things that can be measured.
It's one of those things that I will never really understand. It's sort of like if someone goes to the car dealership and someone says, oh yeah, I've got this great car that can fly, it'll cook your dinner, clean your house, teleport you instantly from place to place. Oh really, can I see it? No, not like you can see like a butterfly or measure a stick or something like that. You just sort of have to have faith that it exists.
It's really the exit point for me, that kind of sentence. For some reason, it seems to be a popular phrase to say. And I suspect because it makes a good springboard into the faith conversation, and that's the conversation they really want to have.
Yeah, you can't have religion without faith, and I think that right there demonstrates that it's wrong, because faith is just not a reliable means to distinguish fact from fiction.
Yeah, exactly. The next point that they then went to in this conversation thought was interesting, and again, it doesn't really help the Christian point at this point. And so one of the phrases was, a person's belief manifests in their behavior. Fine with a statement like that. I'm pretty sure a lot of psychologists would be very happy to endorse that statement. But what that statement does not do is it does not validate the belief. All it does is confirm that there is a behavior type that follows from a certain belief type. Okay, fine. And if you behaving in a good way requires you to hold a certain belief, then maybe I'm pro you holding that belief. But that doesn't validate anything about the belief that you hold. It just means that you've got a mechanism within your brain that predicates certain behavior.
And this goes back to the flaw in Christian thinking, the flaw in their epistemology, because, as you said, just because someone believes something and changes their actions based on that belief doesn't really demonstrate that that belief is actually true. And I think it actually shows that Rowan's belief is not predicated on any sort of evidence or anything. It's mostly on feelings and faith, because he likes the feeling of being in a community that is Christian. He doesn't really have any evidence that Christianity is true, but he likes this community and he likes the way people behave around him, and or at least, most people or some people.
If these words were coming from somebody who was lower down the food chain in terms of the church hierarchy, someone who was just a minister at a local church who was new to the ministry, and they were saying these kinds of things, I probably hazard a guess that they were possibly one of these multitude of pastors who we've heard about, who is edging towards the door and on their way out. It didn't sound like somebody who was saying it with conviction. It sounded like somebody who was saying it to maintain the status quo, but were really hiding that they didn't really buy it themselves. But coming from the person who it came from, I'm very, very reluctant to make that kind of accusation at him.
I don't know that it really strikes me that way. I think it just goes to show that even with whatever the 2 or 3 PhDs he has, when it comes to religion, people just shut off their brains. Or maybe it was because his audience was general audience. I wonder if he would have given different answers had he been talking to a more scientifically minded audience, or maybe a more theologically astute audience.
Potentially. It's very possible that he moderates the phrases that he uses according to the audience that he's got. I mean, he does enough public speaking that he's probably experienced at that.
Yeah, because I've never seen him talk anywhere else but here, so I don't know.
I'd like to move on because it sort of progresses the conversation, but this is where he came up with another sentence which again made me sit up and listen, but for a very, very different reason. This was in response to the subject of, is God truly listening? And this is based on the assumption that God is someone with whom we can communicate. And then the tail end of that kind of lead-in was, what is God like? Rowan's answer to that was, well, no one can really answer that bit. And then he clarified that. And this was probably where he was the most certain of all this evening. He said, anybody who claims that they can know what God's like risks blasphemy. And then he paused and said, and I really mean that. I see this kind of confidence in God's character quite a lot in some of the internet discussions I have, normally from people who are at the Calvinist end of Christianity. And Rowan Williams isn't at the Calvinist end of Christianity, which probably explains that kind of thing. But I see an awful lot of Christians with an awful lot of confidence in their statements about what is God like. There's one specific individual I'm thinking about who's very regularly on the Unbelievable boards, who seems to have this thing against any kind of same-sex attraction or any kind of activity that comes under the umbrella of LGBTQ plus or anything like that, or trans, anything like that. He's really it seems to be a thing for him, and he's absolutely against that, and he's absolutely certain that God is against that. And it strikes me that that's the level of certainty that Rowan Williams was talking about here. So I would be quite interested to hear that kind of position that Rowan took in conversation with the kind of thing that I'm just talking about now, and have those two characters meeting and having that conversation and working out where the blasphemy is in there. Because I would genuinely be interested in where that gets nailed down to, because I don't see where the link is. And I'd like to know where the confidence of that link is. Sorry, go ahead, Darren. I've talked enough.
Yeah, I don't think it would make a difference because even after Rowan said that, he went on very confidently to tell us that God was loving, very intelligent, the source of all things. So I don't think that he really meant that. I think he meant other people disagreeing with the stance of the church shouldn't worry about blasphemy.
Okay, maybe he meant it in a different way to the way I've just expounded, which again, that points to the lack of clarity and lack of substance, which we referred to right at the very beginning. If he's going to say something like that, and then it's not absolutely clear exactly what it is that he means, and two people listening can come up with a slightly different interpretation, then what other interpretations does everybody else have? Yeah,
and I mean, interpretations in the church and the believers is all over the place. I think that's another piece of evidence that the religion is false, because you can have 200 different believers in the same room talking about it, and you'll probably come up with 250 or 300 different opinions about what God is and what he does.
Yes. On the question of God and the character, we've got the usual things coming up of loving and cares for us, but nothing more substantial than that. So it then moved on a little bit more and talked about suffering, which led into a little bit of healing. And it was the usual suspects in terms of the answers here. God made the world. We need to accept what happens in it. God does not leave the world without his presence. But Rowan did also acknowledge that no one has really fully met the challenge that this question offers. And still no one has ever fully met the challenge that this question offers.
Well, I think the reason he recognizes that is because every time anyone gives an answer to that, even the answers Rowan gave, God is no longer loving. He turns out to be a psychopath. I mean, it was later on that someone asked, was COVID sent as a test for humanity? Something like 275 million people have died so far from COVID around the world. And his response was, well, maybe God is asking us to change or showing us how to be better. So it makes me wonder, God killed 250 million people just to make a point? He couldn't have made that point without killing, all those people?
Yeah. As we've gone on to COVID, when he was asked about COVID being a test, he didn't say an emphatic no.
His wording was, God is asking us to change. That's what his exact wording was, is asking us to.
Yeah, which leaves a lot to the imagination, really, on where the relationship between God and COVID is. I didn't note that bit down, but I did note that he said that there's opportunities for us to learn from challenges and tragedies like this. And yes, that is true, but we don't need a God in order to take advantage of those opportunities to learn. Human invention comes out of necessity. The only reason why we've had this vaccine so quickly is because it was necessary for us to create this vaccine so quickly. If there was no COVID, nobody would have put those resources into making a vaccine like that. Human ingenuity comes out of those necessities. We don't need a God for it. So the learning there is learning that what humans can do. And if we really put our minds to it, there is much that we can do. And if we can work together, think how much better we could do at overcoming things like this. But I really don't see where the requirement for a God is in any of that for us to learn those lessons.
Yeah, plus we only need to learn the lessons because of the world that we live in. Had God created a different world, those lessons wouldn't even be necessary.
Yeah. Or we could even have the knowledge without having to go through the pain of the lesson.
No, you can't do that. You have to die. 275 million people have to die in order to teach a lesson. That's how God did it.
Yeah, I don't want it to be that way.
But I mean, it goes back to this idea that God is loving. I have no clue what a Christian means when they say loving, because every time they try to explain it, God always comes out as a psychopath.
Yeah, and this is touching on a conversation that Andrew had with our friend David over at Skeptics and Seekers, and I'm probably going to have that conversation shortly. The question is, if God revealed himself, what would your response be? Would your response be to worship? And part of my answer to why I couldn't worship the Christian God, if the Christian God existed, is this very thing. I can't, as a parent, I look at what I would do if I had that opportunity to my child, and look at how I view the Christian God. And there is such a mismatch between what I expect as a human parent and what I see as a allegedly perfect, allegedly loving, allegedly God. And the difference is just so palpable that I cannot have any kind of respect for that kind of being, given the power that being has.
One of the questions he was asked was, did God create evil? And he went on about God didn't create evil, but sometimes the world malfunctions. And I think at some point, I would love Christians to actually create a video game from scratch. No frameworks, nothing like that, completely from scratch. Because then you get a different perspective on what it means to actually create a world. In a game world, if you want the world to malfunction because of people's decisions, you have to create their ability to have those decisions. You have to create the ramifications of those decisions, and you have to create the malfunction so that it actually happens, because if you don't create it first, it can't happen. So when Christians say that God didn't create evil, and he's defining evil in this case as a malfunction of the proper working order of the universe, but then he went on to say that the world just malfunctions. That is a completely incoherent statement, because without God creating the malfunction, the world could not malfunction. It would just be logically impossible to do. And I don't think that Christians really understand that, because they act like God had these rules he had to follow when he was creating the world, and he just couldn't have done it any other way, which means that they're not actually worshiping the God that created the universe. They're worshiping just the guy that put things together.
But I wanted to skip on to what was my question, which was, how do I tell the difference between a God who is silent and a God who wasn't there? And the first response was, yeah, that's a good question, and many have approached it. Then it was the usual blather, I'm afraid.
Yeah, in my notes I have the sort of the answer from that was, even if you don't see God, others see God in you. And I'm not entirely sure how that responded to the actual question, but that's what we got out of it.
There was also something about when God's closest to you, you can't see him. I think it was some kind of analogy of if someone's hugging you, you can't see their face. Yeah, that's a standard Christian apologetic trick, that one is. When you can't see God, it's because he's carrying you or something like that.
Yeah, and see, that's God lying to them, wanting to take credit for things he didn't do, because according to the Christian mythology, God gives people free will, so he doesn't do mind control. So he couldn't actually logically carry them, because that would mean that he was mind controlling their actions during that tough time and denying them free will. So even from the Christian mythology, that entire thing is incoherent.
Yeah, it is. It's a classic case of eating their cake and having it too. I'm disappointed because I wanted to like this one more. I know of Rowan Williams's intellectual reputation, so I wanted something that was going to intellectually challenge me. Genuinely, I mean that genuinely. I wanted something that was going to intellectually challenge me, and I didn't. And what I've done is I've effectively got a set of notes which look depressingly similar to what might be called a religious phrase bingo card. And that's disappointing. That's really not how I wanted to end this course, because we've had some people that I liked, some people I enjoyed listening to. And this one here, where the intellectual heights were promised, I feel completely let down.
Did they really promise intellectual heights, though?
No, they didn't promise intellectual heights. I came hoping for them, and have thrown in the word promise there because of my expectation. So maybe it's an expectation problem, but I wanted much more than I got from this.
Well, what's interesting was the whole thing was titled, "Does God Answer Prayer?" or something like that.
It was
right?
Prayer and Spirituality. Is God really listening?
Yeah, is God really listening? And I think they worded that like that on purpose, because throughout the entire thing, they sort of got to the point where God is not actually doing anything for you. In fact, the people that expect God to be a bell pull soon learn that he doesn't actually answer any questions. So they just go to basic, worship, glorifying his name in their prayers rather than actually asking for things. And I thought a lot of this was sort of a distraction from that main topic. But I mean, what else can you say when your stance is that God doesn't really ever answer any prayers? The only reason he's there is to create the universe, sustain the universe, and then receive your adoration and worship so you can go to heaven.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting is the way the question's phrased. Is God really listening? Well, it's easy to answer yes to that. The difficult bit to answer is, what does God do then? The question I want to see answered is, does God really answer? Because that means we're getting something back. And if you're going to answer yes to that, the follow-up is going to be, okay, cool, let's see it. Let's see where those answers are coming. Let's go to the place where we can see the effects of those answers. But if you phrase it as, is God listening, and you say confidently yes to that, then you're not obligated to the answering bit.
Well, given that 5.2 million children under 5 years old die from preventable and treatable causes every year, I would say that's a pretty resounding no. God does not respond.
Or you're only counting the people who don't get an answer. You're ignoring all the people who do.
Well, given that people that claim that they get an answer can't prove it, and we know that their God is supposed to be loving, I think they're at a little disadvantage there going that tact.
Yes, and it's also not consistent. Is God really listening? Well, if I can't tell the difference, then the answer may as well be no. If everybody can't feel it, then nobody is feeling it. I think is probably the way I'd go on that one. It really does have to be all or nothing, because if God is perfect, God is loving, and God is consistent, then surely everybody needs to feel it.
Part of the problem is that people are told when they're children that their feelings are from God. So they grow up believing that, and that's the evidence that they provide. And yet we know that feelings are chemical reactions in the brain. They're not these magical things that just happen. And because humans are so feeling oriented, I mean, something like 95% of the calculations we do are subconscious, even when we're making decisions. I think until you can show people that their feelings are actual chemical reactions rather than this God thing, I think they're going to think they have this self-revelation from God because they feel love sometimes, or excitement, or awe. Until you can teach people to think correctly, or not even correctly, but critically, to use their reasoning ability that God supposedly gave us, rather than just going with the whim of whatever their feelings are at the time, I think you're going to have a hard time convincing anyone that God isn't answering their prayers.
Yeah. So that covers that off. So any final thoughts from the last 5 weeks that we've had, Darren? Any highlights, any lowlights?
Well, it's definitely different than what I was thinking it was going to be, because when you go into a thing called the Christian Evidence Society, and anytime any of the speakers are asked about evidence for God, they not only don't provide any, but say, oh yeah, no, there's none. It kind of makes me think, is the Christian Evidence Society doing it correctly? It just seems counterproductive.
Yes, that's a very fair question. And I think you raised this. I don't think this is the first time you've raised that. You've mentioned it a couple of times, I'm pretty sure. It's an interesting name, but we really haven't had anything that you or I would agree on as evidence. We've had arguments and suggestions, obviously.
Well, it was asked from two of the different speakers, and they both said, no, there is no concrete evidence. Then they went on to like fluffy stuff, feeling stuff. I mean, Rowan even said the same thing. He said, when asked what is the evidence for God is, he said, oh, there's no cast iron proof. Not like butterflies, or I think electrons was another example.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe the Christian Argument Society or something like that. Maybe we need to get one of them on and suggest some alternative names for them, being a bit cheeky.
I think that might help them out with their cause, because the name of an organization is supposed to sort of direct what they're doing, and this one clearly doesn't.
Yeah, they are an organization that has some history. I think, I can't remember now, they did a bit of spiel at the beginning, didn't they, about some of the history of the society, and they did break up into different, I was going to say factions probably isn't the right phrase there. They had lots of like subgroups around the country, but there's only the original one left now. But I think it's more than 100 years ago or something like that they were formed.
Yeah, I wonder what their history on trying to find evidence is like. I mean, did they like start to try find evidence at the very beginning 100 years ago, and then they just slowly started to move away from that? Or
those are really good questions.
Or did they never start looking for evidence? They were never that kind of organization. I'd be sort of curious to figure out the history there.
It is. Now, when we've done these kinds of things, we've reached out and tried to get people on board. We did that with Alpha, but we didn't get anyone on the podcast, even though I did get somebody to talk to about it. We did that with Genexus, and we got Paul Downs from Genexus on that. So I've not reached out to the Christian Evidence Society. Normally I do this right at the beginning, so I will do that. I'll reach out to them, thank them for their time, for what they've done, and see if I can get one of them onto the podcast and see if we can have a conversation. So we'll see where that goes. And I'll announce it when I have some news. Anything else that you want to highlight from the last 5 weeks? For me, I think the highlight was last week's, the climate change one, because the reason why I enjoyed that one the most was because there was more science, inverted commas, in that one. And he talked, when we mentioned about that, he talked about the evidence about the world and what we can do about the world and what we can do to look after the world. It was when he was talking about that and not talking about his Christianity that I engaged the most and I enjoyed it the most.
I think that says more about the series from the Christian Evidence Society than anything else.
Possibly so. It'll be interesting to see what other people's responses are to my take on that. But that's certainly my takeaway. I enjoyed Mike Hulme the most out of everybody, purely for that reason.
Yeah, I don't know if I had a favorite really. They all sort of start blurring together. This is sort of my problem. I've been doing this for 15, 20 years now. My first degree was looking at religions from all over the world. So I've read lots of holy books. Having this sort of fluff that doesn't get into any of the details for how it's true or why we should believe it or anything really. It's not even the social stances that they take seem more because of their humanism rather than that they're trying to tie into their Christianity than anything else. I mean, like the climate change talk, that had absolutely almost nothing to do with Christianity, except that a lot of Christians in the US are right-wing nuts that deny everything that doesn't come from their Bibles. So, I mean, we've got an Ark museum for crying out loud.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't know, it just was not very instructive. It wasn't very enlightening. I don't know what their real purpose for the whole thing was. You're an ex-Christian, so maybe you have a better idea than I am. If you were a Christian going into this series, would you have gotten anything out of it?
That's a really good question. And I haven't spent as much time thinking about it as I might have done a couple of years ago, if I'm really honest. I'm much more in the mode of challenging Christianity rather than seeing if I can pull anything back out of Christianity. I think for me, that ship has probably sailed now. I think I would have out of the platitudes, because there are very familiar platitudes on there, kind of Christianese kind of speak, and I'd have probably read deeper meaning into a lot of the things that were said than I do now. So I'd have probably got something out of those. I'd have probably got a lot more out of the Gillian Straine one about the healing and the wholeness, because she talked a lot about the wholeness of somebody, and that kind of has a specific meaning in Christianese. And I'd have probably got a lot more out of that, I think, had I been a Christian. And I think hers would have probably been more meaningful to me. And I think if I was still a Christian, I'd have come away saying that I'd enjoyed hers much, much more than everybody else's. And I'd have probably enjoyed the Jonathan Aitken one as well, because of the turnaround in his character, whereas we spent a lot more of it being a bit dubious about the story. I think as a Christian, I'd have been more taken by his story.
Yeah, I don't, having never come out of that tradition, it's sort of hard for me to think of what a Christian could get out of this, because there was just no real substance to any of it.
Yeah, I agree. I'm reminding of a conversation I had a long time ago with a Christian. Again, it's your typical Facebook conversation, and I was challenging and asking questions. And this lady that I was in this particular conversation with, I'm assuming she got frustrated at some point, but anyway, the response basically came back: sometimes you've got to stop asking questions and just believe. And that moment and that phrase has stuck with me for however long it is since I read it on the screen in front of me. And I think that typifies a lot of Christian thinking, and it probably typifies the kind of things that we've experienced the last 5 weeks. And it goes straight to the heart of the criticisms that we have as well, because I don't accept that stopping asking questions is a good thing to do. For me, asking questions is absolutely essential. I'm a questions person now. I want to ask questions. I want to challenge. I want to ask questions which have difficult answers. I want to ask questions where finding the answer is an interesting experience in itself. But I want the engagement of trying to find the answer to the question, and talking around the subject, talking around the difficulty of the subject, talking around the mystery of the subject isn't a satisfactory solution for me, but it is a satisfactory solution for the believing Christian. And it's that change in mentality and that difference in mentality, I think, that separates us. And I think unless you've been there in that accepting, unquestioning mentality, it's probably quite hard to comprehend what this means. Have I managed to explain that without patronizing you, Darren?
Oh, you can patronize me all you want. I don't care.
Oh, okay.
I think I understand. I used to, a few years ago, I told a friend that people don't care about facts. They only care about feelings. And of course, his response was to say, oh, people care about facts. And then he went on about how they care about their feelings without realizing that's what he was
Yeah.
saying. And I'm wondering if I was slightly incorrect there. I wonder if people care about facts, but they don't care about demonstrating that what they're calling facts are, in fact, facts. We have a phrase in the United States called alternative facts.
Mm.
And these alternative facts are basically just whatever anyone tells you, regardless of whether they match up with the facts that everyone else accepts. And I'm curious if that's the main difference between people.
Yes, and I think there's a bubble effect going on here. I think this is worth saying because it's part of the conversation that we're having. But listeners, if you haven't already heard it, I recommend you go and find the Graceful Atheist podcast. Go through the back catalogue for about a year, probably more than a year now. I'm pretty sure it's more than a year. There'll be an episode with me being interviewed by the Graceful Atheist. Listen to that for the story, a little bit more in-depth story of my deconstruction, because it just touches on, but the bit I'll give is just what's touching on the subject that Darren and I are talking about now. When I was in the Christian bubble, in that safe place, I wasn't really questioning the facts. I was accepting and I was enjoying the feels, and it was a nice, happy place to be. The questioning of the facts, I mean, there were multiple points, but one of the major turning points, and the one that I reference on the podcast that I've just pointed you to, people I've known online for the past 20 years, they knew I was a Christian. And at that time, I wasn't just a Christian, I was a young earth creationist. And one day there was a big conversation on evolution, and I jumped in on it with the standard creationist talking points and got utterly hammered in the conversation points. And it was emotionally and intellectually quite bruising for me. That was a turning point. And I think at that point, facts became more important to me. And so I set out to try to find out where they were wrong. And I didn't find out where they were wrong. I found out that actually they were right, and I was the one who was more than likely in the wrong. And then eventually I found out that actually I wasn't the wrong.
It's the 21st century. We can send SUV-sized rovers to Mars to explore for us. We've sent satellites out to the beyond our solar system, gathering information. We can do podcasts like this where we're on literally opposite sides of the world.
Yeah.
And we're talking real time with each other and recording it and sending it out to billions of people. And yet people still believe in gods and magic.
Yeah.
And that dichotomy just fascinates me. How do people believe that? How do they justify their belief? You know, it just floors me that something so obviously false, that is surrounded by a completely incoherent story, has a quarter or a third of the world actually believing it? I just don't get it. So that's why I still do this. Maybe someday I'll figure it out.
Thank you for that, Darren. Thank you for joining myself and Andrew when he was able to on these. It's always good to chew over these things with someone who's got a very different perspective in terms of their background to myself, because Andrew and I have got very similar backgrounds. So we often have the same talking points. You've usually got a slightly different angle on it, and I appreciate that. So thank you for joining us. As a bit of a teaser, listeners, and I know I've promised this several times, we have got it in operation. We've done the Alpha course. We've done our series of reviews on that. We are still going to do a review of the Youth Alpha series. It won't be as many episodes as we did for the main Alpha, but we are going to do a review of the Youth Alpha. We haven't forgotten to do that. So if you're wondering what's going to happen with that, please hang on a little bit longer. We are going to do that. I'm probably going to rope Darren in on listening to that. Again, I'll announce that when we're doing it properly. It's not recorded yet. We haven't even planned how we're going to do that yet, but that is going to come later on in the year. Thanks for sticking with us. I've now got to edit this. Thanks again for your time, Darren. Sorry you couldn't be with us, Andrew. We missed you. It's always nice to have you on here as well. And until the next episode, thank you for listening. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.